Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung, athletes, and welcome to the latest episode of the 2000 AD Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. I am your host, Mulchar. And on this episode, we talked to an artist who, well, let's just say their style was a bit of an acquired taste in the 1990s. Steve Sampson was an artist who came to 2000 AD and the Judge Dredd Megazine with Brit-Cit Babes, Judge Anderson, and his style, there's lots of influences going on there, and as you'll hear in the interview, we discuss how 1990s his style actually was. Some people liked it, some people didn't, and it was wonderful to be able to connect with Steve, who's someone who actually has quite a body of work at 2000 AD in the magazine, and yet doesn't necessarily have the legacy of an awful lot of artists of the period. So it was interesting to sit down with him, see how he feels about it now, talk a bit about how he came to 2000 AD and the development of his style. It's fascinating to hear about how he was part of a kind of collective that built up around the south coast in England around about the same time, with some other names you may well recognise. So going to be chatting to him in a second. As always, if you have ideas for the Thrillcast, drop me a line at thrillcast@2000ad.com. That's Thrillcast, all one word, at 2000ad.com. We're going to be continuing with the lockdown tapes on a weekly schedule, and we've got some really interesting episodes coming up in the future. Again, not going to do a big kind of corporate spiel with this one because it's a nice chunky interview and I know you like them, athletes. So we're going to crack on and have a chat with Steve Sampson, artist on Brit-Cit Babes, and Judge Anderson. I've really enjoyed speaking to people who were creators during the phase when I first started reading 2000 AD on a regular basis, which was the 1990s. Right. So I've spoken to Dermot Power and Sean Phillips and people like that. And of course, me coming to the prog corresponds exactly with you starting to work for the Meg and then the prog. And I want to get, rather than just kind of just focus on your 2000 AD and magazine work, I want to get an overview of your career and how you came to it. Let's I guess start at the beginning. Tell me about yourself and your origin story, if you will.
Okay, I'll try and keep it concise. Well, as a kid, I the two things I just loved doing were either playing football or drawing. Wasn't very good at playing football, didn't know whether I was any good at drawing, but I got really fortunate and ended up with an art teacher that sort of took me through, to sort of 16, 17. He was just brilliant.
Yeah.
He really encouraged me, and he made me aim to try and sort of go to art college, and he had been to Chelsea Art College. I was living in Buckinghamshire at the time, although I originally come from the East End of London. And so I did end up doing that, but unfortunately I didn't enjoy it, so I quit after a year. I just did the foundation course and didn't carry on. I kind of wished I had now, but at the time it was probably the right thing. But I became a sheet metal worker, and I was doing that for 4 years, but all the time I was kind of drawing. I did lots of that. This is way back before computers, obviously. So I used to do that sort of stuff where, I'd draw Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley for 20 quid for someone and stuff like that. But all the time while doing this quite physical job all day and the Saturday morning. But any other time I would either be playing football occasionally or drawing. And then I got into the habit of sending a little booklet of photos out with a return envelope to people. And I never, to this day, I never really know how that book, it got to Steve McManus at 2000 AD, who was the then editor. And I'm sure that I didn't send it there, but it got there somehow, or he saw it. And part of the stuff that was in the photographs of artwork were, I had a mate who had a band, and he had written a story, and the story was about a character called Dr. Love, and I'd done some illustrations of pages from the story, and Steve really liked it, really liked the idea, liked the artwork, liked the story. So we were asked to go down and see him, and to cut a very long story short, they really liked it, but they wanted some adjustments made to the story so that it would fit within the world of, Mega City in 2000 AD. Unfortunately, my mate didn't really want to change it. We won't get into that too much, but it was quite frustrating. He made some changes and it kept going backwards and forwards, and eventually Steve gave me a phone call and sort of said, unfortunately, it didn't look like it was going to work, but would I be interested in, illustrating any other stuff? And that started it, really. I think the first thing I did was just a 6-page Tyranny Rex story. Got some help from Paul Neal after that about comic book storytelling that I've made a few errors of in my 6-page strip. And then the next thing was I'd done some character designs that were no part of any story, and Steve really liked them, and I think he showed them to John Wagner, and he had done this story called Brit-Cit Babes, and it just seemed to match up for them. The characters that I'd done could be the characters that John had in his story, and that started that, really. So yeah, it was quite a sort of strange way of getting there. I mean, as a kid, when I did draw, I loved drawing. I bought all sort of American superhero comics and, what British comics there were. So comics were like a big thing, but how you would go about to get into that industry, I didn't have a clue. But eventually, yeah, I ended up there. And then running through that quickly, I think they were looking for a new artist to do Anderson, because Arthur Ranson, I think, was doing some American stuff, and he was the Anderson artist at the time. So Alan Grant wrote a 6-part story, and it was given to different artists, and I was one of them. And from that, I don't know how much of it was Alan's choice, but between Alan and the comic, they decided that I would do Anderson, and that started a great relationship with Alan. He was just a joy to work with, and I loved Anderson. It was fun times. Although the very last story I ever did, which was the Crusades, that was quite that was quite a backbreaker. That there's like millions and millions of kids in that story, and
well, traditionally that's how comics tends to finish off. Well, 2018 particularly tends to finish off artists, because that was one of the things that broke Mick McMahon when he was doing.
Right. So it's funny that you should say that, because I never really knew Mick, and then after I stopped, I sort of found my way into the games industry, and slowly sort of stopped doing comics and got into the games industry. And after I'd been doing that for a few years, we were in a studio in Brighton. I live just outside Brighton now, and we were a game studio that did mostly racing games. And the art director, he came round one day and he said, "We've got some guy coming in that I'm going to interview for a job. He used to do 2000 AD. You used to do that, didn't you?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I said, "Who is it?" And he said it was Mick McMahon, and I was stunned, because Mick was one of my real heroes, and he said, "Oh, is he good?" I said, "I can't for 1 minute understand why he's coming in here for a job. But if he really wants one, just give him one." And he did get the job, and then we become good friends throughout that time that he was doing games. And chatting to me, we had lots of talks about the millions of characters in the Cursed Earth and in my story. So it was quite a strange to actually talk to him about that. And he just fancied a change. So got into doing games, but every single day that I saw him, I'd walk away just shaking my head, thinking, "What is he doing here? Doing racing games." I think we both worked on a Hot Wheels racing game at the time, which was just bizarre.
You've gone through an awful lot of history. I do want to kind of rewind a little bit and just talk about your early attitudes towards art, because like I say, you went to art school for a time.
Yes.
Were you always drawing? Was this something that fairly early on you decided you wanted to do?
I did. I did love drawing. I think it's really different, especially for people these days. I get, in the games industry and as an illustrator, because I do sort of other illustration stuff outside the games job, that there seems to be a lot more awareness of what you can do if you've got a talent to draw and to do art these days, or there's lots more avenues to go to. Whereas back then, I didn't know what you could do with being able to draw, other than being a fine art painter or something. Comics, I obviously knew about and loved, but I didn't really understand how that worked, until I had the meetings with Steve at a comic. So it was one of those things where it was like, well, I've got some talent in this, and there's lots of people that have, and there's actually people that I'd seen work that they'd sent into 2000 AD to Steve or to Dave Bishop later. Absolutely stunning artists, beautiful artwork, but they just couldn't get to grips with doing comics. So it's a very particular type of skill to have. I think you can't just be a good artist, and there's deadlines was a big thing, and as well, something that I was really good at hitting was deadlines, and lots of people just can't do that. But I loved doing it. I was encouraged, especially by my mum when I was younger. She always encouraged me to do that. I kind of lost her when I was 16. She died of cancer, and it wasn't long after that, early 20s, that my dad passed away as well. So I then kind of had this almost fear and panic of I've got to earn a living somehow, and I've got to make it work, because there's kind of no fallback. There's nowhere to go home to if this doesn't work out. And that, doing the stuff for 2000 AD kind of all happened right at that time, just after my dad passed away. So it's kind of quite a weird time, but I absolutely loved doing comics. Although I think if I could go back and take the computer with me and take my Cintiq, my lovely big Cintiq that's sitting here with me, I'd enjoy it a lot more. But the flip side is the actual, the sort of slog of doing a strip. So, there is part of me that sort of, I look back and very, very grateful for my days on the comic, because it kind of started me out as an illustrator, really. I've done a few editorial stuff here and there, bits and pieces. I did win a competition designing a carrier bag for Our Price Records through Sky magazine that was out at the time, and actually went down and had a big page spread done in Sky magazine. I think that Bros were on the cover, if I remember well.
That sentence could be dug up by archaeologists, and none of it will make any sense.
No, it won't. But the really good, cool thing that I liked was that I think inside they had an article on Mickey Rourke, I think, at the time, and I was really into Mickey Rourke at the time, so that's quite cool. I do remember wishing they'd put the Mickey Rourke on the cover and not Ross. But so bits and pieces like that. But the comic really set me off. Really, I still, so I'm really grateful, especially to Steve at the time, and then later David Bishop, for all the sort of encouragement. Because I kind of look back and think that my style was very Marmite. I think people either loved it or they hated it, which is fine, and that probably they still do. But I've never had a problem with that because, that's art. Some people like it, some people don't. And, and although I look back really, really fondly on the time doing the comic and all the conventions and all that, I find it difficult to look at the artwork these days because obviously you move on and hopefully you feel you've got better. And, I might have approached it a bit differently had I started these days.
One thing I do need to ask about,
yes,
is the work you were doing for Men Only, which was I don't even know.
I was going to mention it, and I didn't know whether to or not. How did you know?
I don't even know if it's still going. But I mean, I suppose the most straightforward way of describing it was a men's entertainment magazine.
Yes.
Full of women without any clothes on. Now,
yeah, it was kind of, let's call it a down market Playboy.
I think you're being very kind there.
Yeah, no, I am. That was just, that was bizarre. And I don't even know, I can't even remember how that came about. Again, it was sending the photo book out, and how it got there, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, that was bizarre. I mean, at the time, it was a lot of fun in the sense that my mates, who I had in the football team, I remember telling them, I've got this, I'm going down to London to Soho to see the people at Men Only because they're interested in me doing some illustrations. And they were all like, whoa, really, Men Only? And I went down, and it was this like tiny little office in Soho, and it was just, the editor at the time, I forget her name, but it was a female editor, and there was just photos around, obviously, the type of photos you can imagine, but that was it. But when I came back, I was telling the guys, there's all these models sort of getting ready for their photo shoot. I had them going for months and months. I mean, that job, I think it went on for ages, like once a month, really. They'd just send you the story. There was always this story of, you can imagine what, set in a different situation. Like I think the first one I did was at a tennis club. And then I did this illustration with tennis and girls and tennis nets and everything. And the editor, she was just delighted with it because I'd given her so much, and they had all these little inset pieces and that. And she said, you don't really have to think about it so much. You just need to do a sort of pretty sexy girl, really. She thought I was just getting too into it, trying to connect it too much to the whole story. But that was part of the fun of it. And that was great fun. That was great fun. Even though it was quite difficult going and buying a copy every month.
Well, it's something that you have in common with, I think it's Neil Gaiman.
Oh, really?
He used to write.
He did the writing of them, right?
Yeah. And it was for Penthouse or something like that. I think.
Right, yeah. No, that was cool. So that was before 2000 AD. So that was one of the sort of jobs. So they were those sort of jobs. But I mean, like I said, this is back in the day where, if I didn't send the photo album out, I'd spend like 2 or 3 days in London just knocking on doors trying to see people, which was almost impossible. You'd never get past the secretary. Whereas these days, you just fire off a website and email, and I'm not saying that's any easier because the volume's probably even more, but it's a lot easier to physically do than what we used to have to do.
Well, I'm interested in your headspace at the time because you this was something you wanted to do. You wanted to illustrate. You were sending these little books off left, right, and centre. But at the same time, as you say, you were working in a sheet metal factory.
Yeah.
And this was what the sort of early 90s.
Yeah. It would have been. Yeah. It was. I mean, part of the thing that kind of pushed me more into it. I think the thing with working in the metalwork factory, the money was really good. I mean, it was hard work, but the money was good. And having being, that sort of age as well, and I'm sort of playing football on a Saturday with my mates, and part of me was like, this is kind of easy, but there was this obsession. I'd always be drawing, always want to be drawing, but not really knowing what to do with it. And then actually it was Thatcher at the time. Where she was just destroying all the industries, the factory that I was working in, it got shut down, so I was made redundant. And it was at that point that I kind of thought, I wonder if there's just anything I could do to earn a living with the artwork, and that's what pushed it. And then I picked up those sort of jobs like the Men Only job and other sort of editorial stuff. But was always still buying comics, reading comics, and doing these illustrations based on this story that my friend had written, and kind of putting that in there as well, because I did a lot of sort of full page shots as well, which are always the most fun to do. So they kind of look good in the photos, and like I said, it's still to this day, I'd love to know if I actually did send it to 2000 AD or whether somebody else passed it on, because I'm not sure how it came about. But yeah, and that was an eye-opener really, because I suppose at that point I kind of imagined there was these artists, the guys that were doing the comic were all sat in a room somewhere in an office, a bit like I do when I'm at the game studio. You're in a studio and there's other artists about. So when I actually got there, and I think they were in it was the Robert Maxwell building at the time, which was quite impressive to go into, the Maxwell building. But then the 2000 AD offices were almost like a broom cupboard from memory. And I was I think I was looking around at the time thinking, where is everybody? Where's all the writers? Where's all the artists?
One thing I do want to ask about is your influences, not just as an artist, but of yourself as well. Because when I've been looking at comments regarding your work and interviews that you've done, one of the things that stood out is how there seems to be an awful lot of, I suppose, like contemporary culture. So your artwork is very 90s. And I just wondered if there was an interplay between like music and your artwork that you were conscious
of. Definitely music, movies, all that stuff, and still does, even to this day, still does. And I've always been really interested in sort of graphics as well, like Designers Republic, they were a big influence, and especially later as well when they did, the Wipeout stuff. They did all the Wipeout game stuff, the branding of that, and then at the time I was doing 2000 AD, there was a period where I shared a flat with Jason Brashill, who you no doubt heard of, who was just a bit younger than me, and he was actually just trying to get into 2000 AD and kind of did it at the time. I'd already been doing it for a little while. And he was based in Brighton as well, and I was living in Brighton, and that's how we sort of, and I just thought he was just a phenomenal artist. But he also had a graffiti crew that used to do graffiti, and I used to hang around with them. I didn't do much graffiti. I wanted everything to be too clean and precise. And it was just too messy, But I used to go around and sort of film them and take photos. And then a bit later, we met up with another, what I would say was a big name for 2000 AD, was Jim Murray. And we become really quite good friends, the three of us. And Jim had come and stay with us quite often. And it was actually Jim that got me into the games industry. He had sort of started doing some stuff for games and sort of suggested it, and that's what started it for me. And then Jason did eventually as well. And both of them, I think, well, Jason definitely, he moved to Seattle. He's working for Valve, and I think last I heard, Jim was working for Valve as well in Seattle. But yeah, definitely music and films and comics. I mean, one of the big sort of influences, not maybe on my style, but I absolutely adored him, was Barry Windsor Smith. I absolutely loved his artwork, and then going back to even to sort of like painters like Klimt. I really like Klimt because it looked very graphical to me as well. Yeah, and then in the period when I got into it, obviously, you know, where lots of music videos, you start to see more and more of that sort of stuff. So that, yeah, and that was very, I don't know, very colourful and graphic to me as well. Lots of the stuff that I liked.
Well, that was one of the things I was going to ask about, because there's a real sense of design, like a crossover between art and graphic design in your work, and it felt very much that you were kind of plugging into the Julian Opie, Gilbert and George, and particularly Julian Opie was influenced by Hergé and his work.
Totally.
So I'm curious about the evolution of your style up to that, up until the point where you started working for 2000 AD, because it was so unique. You know, there wasn't really any.
It was really different, wasn't it? It was, and it was also I loved, because it was all like obviously hand drawn and hand painted, and the paints that I loved were gouache paints. You know, and I know a lot more of the guys were probably using acrylics, and I did sort of move into acrylics towards the end, and some airbrush stuff. But that was probably more coming from hanging around and sharing a flat with Jason, because that was the sort of stuff he was using. But for me, I just loved that, I don't know, this kind of flat shaded stuff and really vibrant colours. For me, with gouache paints, the colours were so vibrant. And I just have always seen things in that sort of shapes and planes, you know. So even when I'm doing sort of shading on a face, it's very, you know, it's not blended. It's not, you know, there's people that can, I have done that over the years when called for, but, you know, I always think it's not really my thing. I like that very graphical element of things. But you're probably right, at the time, it was a bit different for 2000 AD, you know, and maybe that's what Steve saw in it, I think, you know, maybe that was it, that it was a bit different. And like I said, I'm sure that people either liked it or they didn't like it, you know. I don't think there's often a grey area, which is fine, you know, it's fine.
It's the fact that when you properly start, it's Brit-Cit Babes, which is you know, the magazine wasn't very old by this point, and this was a series that well, it came in with that great Bolland cover.
Yeah, that was just.
And it's written by John Wagner, and that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
On a new artist.
Yeah.
Did you?
No, it was. I think I was a little bit maybe naive, really. I mean, I did realise it at the time. I knew what the names were, you know. And actually, it was that added. There was an added pressure because those characters were pre-designed. You know, they were done as characters. That I can't even remember what the names of them now. But the dark-haired girl, the Boland cover, she was a character that I'd just done some shots of, and I'd called her Faith, I think, at the time. But Steve had shown these to John, and John, I think, straight away said, I've got this story. I think these characters would work for this story. So it was like getting thrown in at the deep end, for sure. But there's this background that I mentioned that I just, like, really quite recently become self-sufficient I had to be. I'd not long lost my dad, and it was kind of like, I've just got to make this work. So, and plus it was like, I almost couldn't believe that there was this opportunity to making a living out of drawing, and even to this day, I get up and, it's all these years later, and sometimes I just think I'm still getting away with it. How has nobody tapped me on the shoulder and gone, come on, we found you out now. To still be, I think, and part of that comes from the fact that I did this 4 years as a sheet metal worker, and total respect for anyone that has to do, especially a manual job, but to do a job but have aspirations that you want to do something else. Because all the time I was at the metalwork factory, I'd be thinking about drawings and, just thinking, oh, wouldn't it be good if I could just do that all day and get paid for it? How good would that be? Rather than do this thing that I had, no passion for whatsoever. But, it was an honest job. It was a hard job. But the thought of going year upon year doing that, I think eventually it would have been quite soul destroying. If you've got anything else in your head that you're sort of wanting to do or thinking you could do. So it was kind of all that. It was like, this is nuts, but somehow I've got to make it work, and when I look back at Brit-Cit Babes, some of it I look at and it's just like, oh, man, why didn't they pull me up on that? That's just, yeah. But at the same time, it must have worked because I got more work after it, So
looking at Brit-Cit Babes now, it is clear just how many graphical elements you were putting into that. Just on a panel by panel basis, there's lots of just quirks. Is that the right word? Where you've clearly looked at something and gone, well, that works in that space. That has sparked something in my mind. Was there a lot of intuition born out of inexperience at this point? Is
yeah, I think you're probably right. I think that's true. Plus, because there was always that graphical sort of vibe for me, I wanted to get that in. And I mean, at the time, there were lots of just stunningly good artists, working for both the magazine and the prog. But because it was clear to me that the style I was doing things in was very, very different as well. And also I just felt like, well, maybe I can make something work out of this because it is a bit different. Because I'd look at the, say, more painted, more sort of blended and painted style, and I'd want to do that because it just looks so good. You look at, I'm trying to think at the time, well, Simon Beardsley for start was just like, tipped everything on its head. And some of the guys you mentioned earlier, Sean and Dermot, fantastic artists. And it's kind of like, I don't know whether you're thinking about, it's not competing, but it's like, you want to be up there amongst them, and in my mind, my way to do that was to have this very different style that, but it wasn't kind of like I was forcing that, because it was, as you've said, I was influenced by this very pop art sort of culture in music and films and and art itself at the time. And I just thought, well, it'd be great to have some of this mixed in with all the the really nice painted stuff as well.
Because you liberally used photo reference. Am I?
Yeah, at the time, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Again, was that a stylistic choice, or was it that you'd not necessarily come from a draftsman's background?
Yeah, a little bit of both, really. I do remember like another artist that was in Brighton at the time was Glenn Fabry, and I remember many times going around Glenn's and just sitting there, just like with mouth dropped open in painting stuff. but but Glenn would be taking photos of himself, and and he'd have all these anatomy books and stuff like that. And I think that I started to understand that a bit better, and maybe towards the end of me doing the comic stuff, it was more taking actual photos. Whereas to begin with, it was kind of like I'd just be reading magazines and seeing stuff, and it'd just be like, oh yeah, well that'd work, that works, but it's why I think Anderson, like the first strip that I did, which was that test strip that Alan did, I'm sure that like within the same 6 pages, she looks like Kim Basinger and Madonna, from. But then later on, when I was doing Anderson, I was actually going out with someone at the time, and she just looked like Anderson to me. She just had the Anderson look. So it was just like, I'll just take photos of her, bless her, Lisa, her name was. And that was really strange, because I remember when we did the Crusades strip, Jason Brashill did one of the covers. He did Anderson in a body bag, which is just a brilliant cover. But so he came round and we did a photo shoot of Lisa, the girl that I was going out with at the time, so that Jason could paint her in the body bag for the strip that I'd done, that was a great period, because it was like I was doing the strip, and my best mate at the time, and guy I ended up sharing a flat with, he did the cover, which was really cool. But yeah, you're right. There was a lot of magazine and magazine and fashion magazines. Used to sort of trawl through them all the time and get ideas for sort of fashion and stuff like that.
I'm always interested in people's reaction to photo reference and things that look in any way photorealistic, or where they can say, "Oh, look, this was clearly inspired by this image," or things like that. Because I think it plugs into a deep down suspicion that some people have that art is easy, or perhaps even the opposite, that it should be really hard. So this is cheating because you're taking an existing thing. Yeah. And you see it even leveled at people like Arthur Ranson, who the incredible artist, is able to produce a style that in lots and lots of cases looks like he's traced it, when it's nothing of the sort. So I'm curious whether you were aware of any backlash against you using that, because to me it just fitted into the pop art aesthetic that you were going for.
Yeah, no, I get that. I totally get that. Yeah, and there is, and there still is to this day. I think back then it was a bit different. I think these days you couldn't do that sort of thing. You couldn't just grab a picture off the internet and for want of a better word, copy it, even though you're not actually, you're not copying it. I mean, in the case of that, Anderson back then, it didn't bother me that she might look a bit like Madonna or a bit like Kim Basinger or whatever. It was just, I thought it was kind of quite cool, because I could kind of see them as Anderson. People will be screaming at the screen now, I'm sure. But back then it just fit for me, especially like someone like Madonna, because she was just like the perfect icon at that time. But these days, if you made Anderson look like Madonna now, you'd get sued to high heaven. I'm sure you would. You couldn't do that. But I think reference is there's so much different type of reference. I don't think. I would say probably the majority of artists probably do use reference in one form or another. Very few. The only one that I've ever known that could just sit down and it just comes straight out of his head without looking at anything was Jason. Jason would just do that, and actually Jim to some degree as well. But most people, if you might look, it might be anatomy reference, because maybe you've not studied anatomy a great deal, so I definitely get it if people want to scream and shout, but that's fine. And I always just think, well, all right, here's the picture, you do it. You know, go on. If it's that easy, get on and do it. Everybody would be doing it. It just isn't. I just think, you know, people find their way of doing their thing, and I'm not saying, you know, a direct copy of something, but you know, and especially not these days. Like I said, I think you just have to be so careful. Because
I guess one of the things also is it's very easy to point this out when you're drawing on images of famous people.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
And I very particular. I can't remember what it's called, but there was a supplement to one of the Megs, which was basically the sexy women of the Judge Dredd Megazine.
Oh yes.
And there
Can
was.
you believe they did that?
I mean, it was the 90s, you know.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
But it seems like that was a presence in your art at the time, was the fact that you would draw attractive women in the strip, you know, and from the very earliest, because Brit-Cit Babes, you know.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it became a bit of a thing for me, and I liked it. I suppose I got lucky because doing Anderson, and like I say, with the relationship with Alan, I just loved it. I loved it. If I could have just done that for the rest of my life, if someone had given me that deal then, even with the difficulties of the millions and millions of children in the last story, I would have signed up for it, because he was just a complete joy, and I thought she was such a cool character, and still do, you know.
Well, let's talk a bit more about Anderson, because you came along just as she buggered off into the cosmos to go and find herself.
Yeah.
Postcards on the Edge has a lot of detractors. It also has a lot of fans.
Yeah.
Were you conscious that this was something different for the character at the time, that this was a new direction? Were you aware of what Alan was trying to achieve with those stories?
Yeah, maybe not right at the very beginning with that first, because like I said, I think I can't remember, was it a 6-parter or something? And if I tell this story and if someone phones in and says he's completely lying, then forgive me. But the way I remember understanding it was, if it was 6 parts, there was going to be 6 artists, and from memory, the last part I think was going to be done by Jamie Hewlett, which would have been amazing, you know. He was doing Tank Girl at the time, such like, but then it never happened. So I think that's why I ended up doing 2 parts. Now you'll have to ask the guys at the time running it why they picked me to do another one. I think I did the first part and then did the last part, but that was only because, to my recollection, Jamie couldn't do it, so someone else had to quickly do another part. But then I remember them saying that Alan really liked what I'd done, and ended up going to see Alan where he was living, stayed with him a weekend, and yeah, just fell in love with him and what he wanted to do with Anderson. And even the Crusade story, which was difficult on many levels, I totally understood what he was doing, because he had this real passion about children and their welfare at the time, and he had a good friend that was in America, I think, from memory, that did a lot of campaigning for children's rights. So there was a lot of, it wasn't just some throwaway story. It meant a real lot to him, even though, like, maybe artistically it was quite difficult for me at times.
Because I mean, a few years ago now, we had him on the podcast, and he was talking about the physical abuse he'd suffered as a child.
Exactly. Yes.
So
exactly.
It's really an issue close to him, and you can see that in Anderson from the 1980s, because her backstory is based around that. With because you did those two parts of well, it was 3 episodes in the end of Postcards of the Edge, and then you had the big long run on 2000 AD from Wonderwall through Crusade, and then Witch, The Great Debate, Horror Story, and then Semper V. I mean, that's quite a chunk of stories. You know, that kind of establishes you as one of the artists on Anderson. The characters had. How do you feel that you were changing, growing, evolving, learning during this period? Were there any setbacks that you encountered? Thought, you know, this isn't going as well as I want it to.
I guess that didn't really. I think with the Crusades thing, we did the first Alice in Wonderland was the first part of that, and I absolutely loved that. I think that was probably one of my favourite, if not my favourite, Anderson stories. That, because I loved Alice in Wonderland, the story anyway. You know, the actual story. So the way he worked Anderson in Wonderland into it, and we were able to do the characters, and it was just great fun. Then I guess, it just became more difficult for me, because I think another aspect to drop in here was that this was going to take about a year to do artistically, I think, and that was all cool, and they'd signed it off and everyone was happy with it, and I was kind of really keen to do it. But then from memory, the schedule of starting it got brought forward because something had gone awry with another strip, and they had to pull it because an artist wasn't getting the work done quick enough, and they knew that I was, you know, good to sort of hit deadlines. So Anderson got moved forward earlier than anticipated, and it was quite a pressurized time, you know, to turn the stuff around all the time. So I guess, and also maybe there was a part of me that, because there was a couple of Anderson stories that definitely the last ones that Arthur had done, you know, with the Satan character, and then from memory, did Kevin? Was it Kevin? I'm trying to remember. There was the one with the aliens, the Anderson story.
The Childhood's End.
Yes. And I love those. So there was probably a little bit of me, but 3/4 of the way through Crusades, that was, why couldn't I just had a nice, or maybe something, because there was also that pressure that I knew how much it meant to Alan. I knew the backstory. I knew what was behind it all, and that added a pressure to it, really. And maybe at some points I would have rather have just had something that, you know, artistically was just, aliens in space or the devil or what, you know, something.
Did you feel that having gone through this stretch, particularly on a difficult story like Crusade, where you do have to draw a lot of things, were you being challenged by these strips? Did you feel that particularly things like crowd scenes were?
Totally. I totally remember just poring over what Mick had done on the Cursed Earth stuff, and how he had approached trying to find different ways of doing. Because I mean, there were panels in there and pages where, you know, in the script it was millions and millions of kids. It literally said that, and it's kind of like, and you know, bearing in mind that you're working on a deadline, you turn these things around. I think back that each page from sketch to fully painted was taking a couple of days, and there wasn't really any room for it to take any longer because of deadlines. So sometimes when you come up with, you know, another panel with millions of kids, how I'll have to dig it out and have a look to see how I did deal with the millions of kids.
I'm curious about how time-consuming your style was at the time, and you know how whether you got quicker or whether you got slower.
Yeah, no, I did get quicker, but it was, you know, it was like I think they were like A3 sketched out and then actually hand painted and then the, you know, the ink sort of line over the top of it. I mean, that's why I sort of say that if I could have the computer and the Cintiq now, you burn through it, just burn through it with a computer, you know. Yeah, I'd love to have had that opportunity to sort of go back and do a few things on the computer now, because it would make a big difference. Yeah, but yeah, you did learn to get quicker, especially like I suppose in the early, when I started off, it was, yeah, I think there was a bit more time as well. The deadlines weren't so sort of harsh, really. And I was just starting out and not really knowing what I was doing, and it was just like, well, I know I've got to get this done by then, but that's fine. I'll, you know, if I have to start late, I'll do it. And then as you start getting older, and life, you know, there's life outside of just doing comics. Sometimes it's not so easy to sort of say, oh yeah, I'll spend the weekend doing it as well, to make up some time, because you've got someone screaming that you want to go out somewhere.
You went on to work on Harmony, which was Chris Stanley's sort of Dread World,
Yeah.
series, and that was I think that had been Trev Hairsine,
Yes,
who had co-created and
brilliant
on that.
Yeah.
That was an interesting change in direction in terms of style of art for that character. Was this something that just came out of the blue? Was like, oh, this is the next job we want you to work on?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly how that started, but yeah, I really liked that as well. The Harmony, it was cool, because I think as much as I love Anderson, I do. She's sort of my favourite, probably female comic character, you know, anywhere of any time. But on a personal level, I prefer brunettes to blondes, so it was kind of like really nice to do. But that kind of felt a bit of pressure as well, because I think the stuff that Trevor had done was just stunningly good. But that also came at a time where I think that's where the switch for acrylics is coming in a little bit there, and some airbrushed background stuff going on there, which was sort of influenced from sort of living with Jason and what he was doing with comics at the time. But yeah, that was good fun. I do remember getting pulled up at a convention. There was a gang in one of the stories, and the leader of the gang, he was a head in a box. And I remember someone coming up and taking great issue with me as to why a head couldn't survive in a box, because it wouldn't have all these. And I'm listening to this guy and really not believing what I'm hearing. Just like, is he serious? And then just sort of pointed out to him that, have you not noticed that the guy standing behind the guy holding the head in the box is a Cyclops? It was pretty cool though. It was pretty cool.
Like I said earlier, your art felt very 90s. You know, clear pop culture aesthetic, lots of recognizable faces. Looking back on it now, I mean, you have kind of touched on this already, but looking back on it now, was this you working through some stuff artistically? Was this you trying to find what your style was, or had that already happened and you're just then, you know, seeing?
No, I think you're right. I think there was a bit of that. Yeah, or especially what my style was in the comic field. Because I think if you look at the men only stuff, that's still the same sort of style. It's very graphic. So that was always my, you know, where I was coming from or where I wanted to go. But yeah, I think working it out within the fields of doing comics, you know, and it's like I say, I mean, I get people, and I knew there was at the time, and you know, even to this day, you know, just hated what I did on it, and would probably like to see me burn in hell, you know, but that's fine. I get it wasn't their flavour. But then the people that really did like it, really did like it, you know, and that's always been a great joy, you know, even to this day. I still get people contacting me and saying how much they loved it. And maybe they loved it because it was just a bit different.
I remember in particular one page of yours, which was from Crusade, which was almost like a Hieronymus Bosch vision of Mega City 1 in metaphor, which was as a meat grinder.
Yes.
That felt very much Julian Opie, you know, that kind of taking different aspects of different influences and bringing them together in a way that makes sense for the metaphor that you're trying to go with. And I personally, I always like to think of your style as a kind of don't take this the wrong way, a stained glass collage.
Yeah.
So you can see the parts of it. You can, you know, it's wonderfully post.
Yeah.
You can see the parts of it that come together, but they come together in a way that is unique to you and your style. If you see what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that it's funny you should pick that page out, because I remember that page. That was a nightmare page, and I ran out of time on that, and I absolutely hated it. I really did. I remember taking it down because I used to hand deliver the artwork. I remember taking it down and just thinking that as David, because it was David Bishop at the time, from memory, as he turns to that page, this is where it all ends. This is where everything ends here. And he absolutely loved it, you know, and he didn't often, you know, they'd say whatever they said, but it wasn't often that he'd really like this. I really like it. I love it. And I was just, and that actually taught me a lesson. It just taught me a lesson that sometimes, you know, for whatever reason, and it stood me good really, because, you know, you quite often, people think you probably, they look at stuff and they're like, why did you do that? That looks so, you know, well, that looks so sloppy, or it doesn't look like you spent any time on it. And it's like, sometimes you haven't got the time to spend on it, you know, and that happens with a lot of jobs, that you've got this much, and if you add double the time or triple the time, you know, you spend more on it and make it even better. But sometimes there's restraints in the background that you're not aware of, you know, but people might still like it. You've just got to do the best you can do within whatever boundaries you've got at the time.
You mentioned David Bishop there, and he can be quite a divisive figure amongst creators and fandom. I like David very much indeed. If he's listening to this, you know, hi David. But you know, he had particular tastes, particular ways of working. What was your relationship with him like? Was it perfunctory? Was it straightforward, or was it a kind of, you know, we get on?
Yeah, no, we got on well. From my memory, we got on really well. I always thought he was great, David. You know, because it's like I said, I started off with Steve, and Steve was this, you know, he was great, and he gave me my start. But then David was there as well at the time, and then when Dave took over, I mean, he could quite easily have sort of said, I don't, you know, I'm just not into your style, and that would have been me done then, you know, with 2000 AD. But he kept me going, and I probably did more of my work for David than I did for Steve. Yeah, I always got on fine with him. I mean, I have, you know, in the years since, I've realised what you've said, that maybe he is quite a diverse figure, but I never had an issue with him, and you know, he always gave me plenty of work, kept me going for ages, for years. So yeah, no issue.
You transitioned to the games industry.
Yeah.
And in this respect, your story is not unique, because there quite a few people that I've interviewed have mentioned that, you know, once they were getting into the late 90s, early 2000s, comics had effectively imploded.
Yeah.
And I just what's your story about how that transition came?
Yeah, that was more like, I think, as I said earlier, that Jim sort of said, you know, maybe you want to have a look at getting into the games industry. And there was a company that was setting up offices in Brighton at the time, but they didn't actually have the office they had it in Fareham, I think, at the time. So I did sort of 6 months training at Fareham, where I actually met Callum Alexander Watts, who had done some 2000 AD. He's now designing costumes for Star Wars, and doing brilliantly. And now it kind of set off a really good friendship with Callum, where I worked with him for years. But yeah, I think for me, more of it was, you know, it was to do with the money. To be quite honest to you, you know, what they were offering in the games industry was just way beyond what I was getting paid in the comics industry, you know. And I guess that kind of started to matter more as you get older, and you think, you know, you're getting into relationships and wanting to, I don't know, buy houses and things like that. You start thinking about stuff like that maybe a bit more. Plus, it was like the other flip for it was that it was a regular job. You were getting taken on, you get holiday pay, you get sickness, pensions, all that stuff that you just didn't get, you know, doing comics. You know, if you took a holiday, you weren't getting paid. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of how that happened. But I kept doing like outside illustration stuff, not so much comic stuff. You know, and I do a lot of, even though I still work for a games company 9 to 5, let's say, outside of that, I'm part of a group called the Poster Posse, and we do promotional posters for movie companies, Disney, Marvel, Sony, Warner's, all of them. And that's kind of really cool, fun, and feels a bit connected to the comic days, because it's almost like doing a comic cover in a way. And do some independent comic stuff. I work with a guy called Bad and James Melanie, who I met back in my 2000 AD days, and he's got a company that he self-published stuff, 8 continent, and they do a zombie comic called Edge of Extinction, and I do some covers for him and bits and pieces. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the game stuff, especially early on, it was difficult. It was difficult not doing comics anymore. It wasn't the same. And plus also I was learning how to use a computer at the time, which, you know, I know people will probably just laugh, but back then it was kind of quite a scary thing I remember going for the interview for the games job, and the art director, I walked in, his name was Joe. I said, "Hi, Joe," shook his hand, and he went, "When can you start?" And I said, "I've never touched a computer." And he's like, "We can teach you that." He goes, "I know your stuff from the comics from 2000 AD. And it's that kind of different artistic element I want to get into the games that we're producing." So
it's fascinating how many comics people, as you said, you know, Jim Murray, Jason Brashill, several others have gone into games, and now we're also seeing quite a few comics people working in film as well. So
yeah, totally.
You know, that alone is fascinating. What was when you started? What was the kind of thing you were doing? Was it just straightforward concept work, or
yeah? Well, that was that's where it kind of all went a bit weird for me, because I was taken on as a concept artist, and I was doing concept stuff, but also doing like in-game screens. I think I did some in-game. The first game I worked on was a Power Rangers game, and I did some Power Rangers illustrations for the sort of, you know, level screens. But then when the studio opened up in Brighton, and we then moved to Brighton, both me and Callum, it was a racing studio. That's what they were going to do, racing games. And the head of the studio was like, I don't need concept artists for racing games. So it's like, so what else can you do? You know, can you do environment art? So we quickly had to learn like 3D and do environment art. And then for the next few years, I became an environment artist in games, and then switched it back where I got made redundant. I was working for a studio that was owned by Disney. Disney shut the studio, and I'd always kept on with the illustration, doing other stuff, and just sort of said, no, if I'm staying in games, then I'm going back to illustrating, and sort of managed to make that pay off.
With your career in games, it's already clear, you know, it's a bit of a steep learning curve. It's something you have to adapt to. Was there a time when you thought, sod this and back off the comics, or that you wondered, you know, is there a future in this? Is there a career in this? And if there was, what was it that has changed your mind?
Staying in games, you mean? I think it's that double thing where I've made kind of a bit of a niche for myself now with what I do, and I kind of enjoy it. I do lots of character, well, most of it is sort of character design, but then also I do like lots of graphics, so branding for worlds, so that it brings that whole graphical element that I've always loved into it, and even doing like car liveries and stuff like that. It's all very graphical, and I think the stuff that I do outside of it, you know, the poster stuff for movies, and you know, because of that kind of stuff, I also landed like jobs with, I did quite a crazy job for NASA a couple of years ago, which was to just design this side of a mobile laboratory, both sides, all the way around. And that was through the poster movie stuff they saw, and they loved it. And that's really graphical. And I think doing that kind of stuff, that kind of feeds stops me thinking, because comics is always there somewhere, I think, in my head. But I mean, I do quite often do covers for people, you know, for a lot of independent stuff, and I really have fun doing those. I'm not quite sure about sitting down and doing a whole strip again, really. It's a young man's game. And you know, the stuff you see out there is just so cool, you know.
I'm curious though, because I was speaking to Anthony Williams on a previous episode, and he's had a similar trajectory to yourself, not necessarily with games, but just with illustration and design. Yeah. I'm wondering here if because you've been able to do stuff like the posters, it has scratched that itch that might otherwise be unscratchable.
Totally it has. You know, I mean, that was one of the things when I did the comics. I always felt I wanted to do more covers than I actually ended up doing. And a lot of the time I didn't have time, especially when we did the Crusade thing. I think when the original schedule for that was set, I was going to do 2 or 3 covers. And then when they had to move it forward, there wasn't time for me to do it. I didn't have enough time to do it. And, you know, and then I say Jason I think Jason did a couple on them. And, you know, and I'd have loved to have done more covers, because it was those one-off sort of image shots that I love doing the most, I think, really, because there's kind of no pressure on them, really. It's like when you got a full-page spread in the strip. They were always the best fun to do, you know. And what Alan was great at doing was, like, even if he hadn't written one of those in, and he was always up for me sort of manipulating the script so that I could get a full-page shot somewhere. You know, but you're right, doing movie posters and promotional art for movies and stuff, it's like doing comic covers, yeah, for sure.
way back at the beginning of your career, you did some spot illustrations for Crisis, and then obviously, you know, there
Yes.
was
Yeah.
various posters and pinups, as we've already
Yeah.
discussed. So it was it the storytelling aspects of comics that occupied a lot of your effort, so that you know, when that was lifted off your shoulders and you just had to draw a static image or a straightforward image, that felt like a release. Was it that?
Yeah, I think that sometimes it's that whole talking head syndrome, you know, when you've got like 3 pages of 6 or 7 panels and it's just 2 characters talking. I think that's why, especially in the early days, like you were saying, there always seemed to be something in a panel, some graphical element. And it was kind of me just trying to make it interesting, maybe for myself, you know, really sometimes. I think, you know, these days, there's just a lot more that you could do, the different angles you can take, and, you know, but there's certain rules that you have to follow. And that was when I had to sit down with Paul Neal from memory. He was always like, you know, this certain characters have to be certain sides, and, you know, you have to sort of telegraph things that are going to appear in panels later on, so that they've just not pulled out like a rabbit out of a hat. You know, it's all this thinking about stuff, you know, and yeah, that wasn't my favorite part of it, maybe, to be honest, you know.
That sense of graphics, that sense of design. I mean, just looking at your tattoos and those excellent overlook cushions that you have on your sofa over there, I mean, it's quite clear where your sympathies in all of this lie, you know.
Yeah. No, it is that, like, I've got a postcard of the NASA thing, so you can see it's quite graphical.
Wow. Do you think it's computers that have allowed you to indulge this aspect of your?
Yeah, totally. I loved it. I mean, when I first started, I learned Illustrator first, which is a very graphical program, you know, and it was only later that I got into Photoshop and really do everything in Photoshop now. But that, yeah, the graphical element and vectors that you use in Illustrator was just, it was kind of like, I kind of thought it to begin with. I remember when we were still doing comics and me and Jace were living together, Jace got himself a Mac, like one of the really early Macs, and it sat in a corner and he didn't touch it for months. And then when he did sort of fire it up, I was just like, this is just never going to work for what we're doing. And then slowly I could see Jason making it work. And then we had a mate who was a real like tech head, and he built me a computer, but it was in a Stella Artois box. It didn't have a case. That's how I had it for about a month, just all inside this with a monitor rigged up till I bought a case for it. And then, but it was all with the mouse then, and not a pad, you know, not a graphics tablet. That came later. So as it's evolved, it's just played into, you know, what I do more and more. And like now, if Flat was on fire, it'd be a toss-up between the cat and the Cintiq, which went out under my arm, you know. And I love the cat a lot.
The stuff that you're doing now, do you think you would have ever reached this point, have this sensibility, have this sense of design without the comics work? Do you think there was a career there for you without comics?
Oh, yeah, in one form or another, I think, you know, but I don't know how I would have. I honestly, you know, like when you mentioned the men only thing, and then I thought of a couple of other things. I never remember those things. I always think my career as an illustrator started with 2000 AD. You know, even though I'd done you know, lots of bits and pieces before that for a good year, maybe before this came along, it just set me off. It really did, you know. And then that led to the games, and I actually got the game job because of what I did in 2000 AD. That was a given at the interview, you know. And then, yeah, so I think I would have done something, but I'm not quite sure what that path would have taken. Really, even looking back now, given the time period, and like I said, I think now I'm not saying it's easier for artists now because there's a lot more of them, and a lot more of them who have got a profile on social media and everything, and can push themselves. But I think there's a lot more obvious or seeable avenues for an artist to maybe pursue than there was back when I got into doing comics. So it was either that or just editorial work, as far as I sort of could have seen it then.
And this is going to sound like an odd question, maybe a silly one, maybe far too broad. How do you feel about your style, your art? Is it the fulfilling thing that I guess you were reaching for at the beginning? Because I first of all, I love this sense of this artistic community that sort of grew up around Brighton. So you've got Glenn Fabry, you've got Jim Murray, you've got Jason Brashall, you've got yourself.
Yeah, Charlie Gillespie was here as well, and the David Lloyd was not far from here as well. Yeah, and that was a pure accident. I came for a day out with a mate. We came in the winter for a day out to Brighton, me and him and his girlfriend, my girlfriend. And a month later, we moved down. And I was doing comics at the time, and so it was easy for me. It was like, yeah, why not? Why not Brighton? And then within a week, I think in the first week, I went to the local comic shop, Dave's comic shop at the time, and I met Glenn then, and might have even met Jason then, who was trying to get into comics. It was kind of like the perfect place for me for doing comics. But there's been periods where I've struggled with my style. I'm sure all artists do. I look at other people that I admire, like Jim and like Jason and then like Glenn and Simon, and look at their styles and just think, I wish I could do it like that. But then, as I've got a bit older, I've kind of felt I just need to do what I do the best I can. And, it's a bit different. And all right, I might not get the superstar status that some of those guys get, but I'm still working, and I'm thankful for that. And like I say, the people that do like it seem to really like it, and I'm always really humbled by that, to be honest.
Because early on in our conversation, you talked about how you lost your mum and your dad in quick succession, and
yeah,
that was a catalyst.
Yeah, it was.
The way that you viewed things. Has that continued to be a catalyst? Has that continued to drive you?
Yeah, it has. Well, I've had this discussion quite recently with a few friends and even my sister, and saying that sometimes I forget about it, but I think that's always at the back of my mind. There's always this, like, even at this point, where I've got my own flat, got a mortgage, I've been married twice, so gone through what people go through life. But I still think at the back of my mind is that thing that set it all going, which is this kind of fear of, the fear partly of having to go back and do something like sheet metal working, and not that that's not a, fair play to anyone that does whatever job they have to do, how difficult it is. But what I'm trying to say is this, if you've got something else in your head, that makes that kind of job so much more difficult, because you're thinking, you're not content with what you're doing. You're thinking there's something else I could be doing maybe. And like I say, luckily, I am still doing that other thing. So maybe I won't have to go back and do sheet metal working again.
And I'm interested in how that has influenced your career, but also how you've made connections through it, because you've talked about meeting Alan Grant and becoming friends with Alan Grant.
Yeah.
You've also made those connections with Jason and Jim and Glenn, etc., etc. And it feels a bit like you've got one of those careers where it is as much about your identity, your sense of self, that what you do and what you are intrinsically linked. There's not necessarily any distance between the two of them. I wonder how conscious you were of that, and if that's ever really, if that's caused you any problems in terms of when things haven't necessarily been going particularly well. You know, you've looked at your career and what the hell am I doing? Now, I realise this all sounds very negative. Around in there. I'm just really curious because it's interesting that, the psychological effects of when the thing that you love is the thing that you do. You know?
Yeah, no, I think that, and I think, you know, for me, it's probably cost me in relationships, because it's like sometimes it's hard to sort of explain to another half that it's more than a job, you know, that I can just put it down 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. That I think that's the thing. I think if I weren't getting paid for it, I'd still be doing it. You know, I'd obviously have to do something else to earn money to pay the bills, but I would still be doing it. And I do think it has cost me at times where, you know, I've spent too much time and too much fault, even when I'm not doing it, you know, where I should be more present in what else is going on, you know. And that's been regretful over certain situations, but then, you know, when we've come to this kind of lockdown and the whole world's gone batshit crazy, I've been so grateful for it, because, you know, I know I have other friends who are suffering, you know, with just the mental side of this whole situation the world's in. Whereas for me, I just get on and paint and draw, and I love doing that. And it's yeah, maybe it's helped in that sense, you know. But yeah, it is there's never been a period where I didn't want it or wished I didn't have it. You know, I've always been grateful for it, I think, really. I mean, it's been scary sometimes when, you know, you get made redundant. So even when I was doing games, that happened big time once, then that was quite scary. But, you know, but you manage and you carry on, and it's like, yeah, I'm still doing this. I have to go and do something else that I've got no clue about what to do, you know. But then, but I'm also totally aware that I'm not everyone's cup of tea, you know. I'm not, but it doesn't bother me. I just think that's fine, you know. I wouldn't argue with people about it, and I wouldn't, you know, if people, you know, I've heard actual people say they hate my style, they hate it, and it's kind of like, that's kind of weird, because I look at loads of art, and follow loads of people on Instagram and stuff, and there's stuff I don't particularly like, but there's nothing I hate. You know, it's quite a strong word. But people get precious about things, you know, especially Anderson, with the caliber of the artists that they had on Anderson before me and after me. I'm sure I'm way down the list on a lot of people's favourite Anderson artists. But I loved it. It was great fun, and, you know, I'm very grateful that I had that chance to do it.
And are you glad that you were able to make the transition to something like games? Was comics?
Yeah, at that time I am. Yeah, I am. You know, maybe if I look back, I'd like to have done comics a bit longer, and maybe I never really kind of looked at that. Maybe, you know, that I met doing American. I think I did some stuff for a Canadian company. I did some covers for a comic called Mr. X. That was great fun. I think I did one cover for Marvel America, which was just bizarre because it was a character. I think he was called the Two Gun Kid. It's like, you know, I get contacted by Marvel, we want you to do a cover. I'm just like, wow, wicked. Who's it going to be? Spider-Man. Who's it going to be? Who? a guy with two Uzis dressed as a cowboy on a horse. Go figure. But, you know, I did a few covers for, I worked for Marvel UK stuff, and yeah, the Crisis comics, and Yeah. I maybe would have liked a bit, but I would have liked a bit longer at it with a computer setup. If I'm being totally honest, if I could have gone into computer games, learned that a bit, and then maybe jumped back into comics for a while, but it just didn't pan out that way.
And I mean, looking back on your 2000 AD stuff, you've already said that you do cringe a little bit here and there, but I guess it's the kind of comic where actually, at that point in time, it was exactly the right kind of place for a style like yours. I don't think I would have expected to have seen it in any other publication than kind of post-crisis 2000 in the magazine.
No, you're right. I think, and I'm grateful for that. I think it was, and that's one of the, total respect for the guys running 2000 AD at that time. They were, they were open to try different stuff, as I'm sure you guys are these days, whereas maybe before that it was a lot of very similar stuff you'd see, especially maybe more so in the American comics. But I think it was 2000 AD that started breaking out different styles and the way you could do comics, and that definitely fed through to what happens in the States. But I'd say that probably did start over here with 2000 AD. But yeah, maybe it was just the perfect timing for me for that, and if all it did was give me a career as an artist for all these years, then for me that's just everything, so I can totally take people not liking it, and what I did is fine, because it started me, and I'm still doing what I love doing today, so definitely grateful for it.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, Steve, for that really interesting chat. I hope you enjoyed that, because I certainly did. It was wonderful to connect with artists that I remember from my initial period of reading 2000 AD and the magazine. So, thanks very much indeed to him. We shall be back in 7 days' time. So make sure that you please help spread the word. Rate us on the podcast provider of your choice. And, when you see the tweets and the Facebook posts, give us a little share and spread the word about the galaxy's greatest podcast. So until then, Earthlets, from myself and everyone at the dispersed 2000 AD Nerve Centre, Splundig Verthrig.
Alert! 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 Thrill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000adonline.com.